Hello, this is Seminar 7. We're going to be looking today at social development. So what exactly is social development? It's a process of planned social change that's designed to promote the well-being of a population as a whole in conjunction with the dynamic process of economic development. So this will come up constantly when you read about social development, the links with economic development. I'm looking at the PowerPoint slides if you want to also follow them as well. I guess the thing about social development that stands out is it's a slightly different approach to promoting welfare. So unlike philanthropic and social work, social development doesn't have that focus of dealing with individuals by providing goods and services or through treatment or through rehabilitation. Social development focuses on the community or society and on the wider social processes and structures. On slide 4, the image there is just sitting alongside the question about what do we mean by structures and how do structures impact on people's lives. So I'd ask you to think for a moment about what are some of the structures that you can think of and how they impact on people's day-to-day living. They may be things such as government, they may be local government, they may be businesses, the type of businesses, the presence of those business, social structures that exist, employment opportunities. There are many different structures that are going to impact on people's opportunities and the way in which people live their lives. The fundamental difference that Midgley, one of the key authors around this work, identifies is that social work intervention is largely known as being focusing on the individual or the family. So where there's identified to be an issue or a problem or a barrier, a lot of social work intervention rests with this notion of individual and family work. And also it bears out too that in Australia most social workers are actually employed mostly in government and also in not-for-profit and the NGO sector. Many of those roles are in specific programs that relate to, say, youth, that relate to employment, that relate to mental health, for example, with the focus primarily being on how to provide support or therapy or interventions for an individual and their family. The distinctive difference with social development is that the focus is also seeking individual well-being. However, it's around removing institutional, social and personal barriers to economic engagement. So again, that term economic engagement, economic participation comes up. When we're looking at social development, it's usually universalistic in its approach. So again, seeking to enhance the well-being of a whole population or a whole group of people, providing changes, assisting changes across a population. It's also dynamic and involves a process of growth and change. So a particular group of people, a particular cohort of a population that might be experiencing a particular issue are not selected and are not identified with this approach. People aren't singled out to have solutions offered to them or services delivered to them. It's really about seeing that there are connections between subgroups of population, smaller groups of population, and that the development will occur with the involvement, inclusion of everyone in that particular society or that particular group. So there's a recognition that the whole of society or the whole of a population or the whole of a community needs to see change happen for the benefits to be felt by individuals. I'm now looking at slide 7 there's a range of understandings or approaches to community development, and one of these is social development. It's really putting community development, in this quote, locating specifically where it interacts with social development. And you will hear in the readings and read many similarities that social development picks up what we understand in its purest form to be community development. In fact, the term social development was used early in the 20th century, was used just prior to the term community development. On slide 8, just having a look at a table that IFE has presented as a way of locating issues and how we see them and how we understand them. So how we see issues, social issues that are impacting on people's lives as workers is going to influence very much the type of solution that one will adopt. So this table is over 2 slides, so over slide 8 and 9. So the perspective, when we're looking at an individual approach, we're looking at an individual who's experiencing a difficulty. If at all there is a source of blame, often the blame will be placed with the victim in an individual perspective. And the source of the problem, when we're looking to understand where did that problem come from, how has that happened, often in the individual perspective, we look at the individual pathology, we look at sociological issues, we look at biological issues, or maybe we look at moral or character defect to work out why is this problem happening. And the solution is usually an individual focused solution, such as therapy or counselling or medical treatment or cognitive behavioural therapy or moral exhortation and control. So the solution to the individual perspective is a particular one that focuses very much on the individual. If the perspective is an institutional reformist, then if there is a source of blame, it's likely to be focusing on blaming the rescuer. So the fault lies within the rescuer. So the institutions that are dealing with that issue are the problem. The court is a source of problems, schools or the welfare department. And the solution to this institutional reformist perspective is that we need to reorganise institutions. We need to create better resources, more resources, better training, further skill development for staff. As I'm speaking about these, probably you're thinking immediately of situations that fit in each of these different perspectives. The institutional reformist perspective at the moment would fit in the Northern Territory with the Royal Commission into the care and detention of vulnerable children, that the source of the problem is seen to be the institutions, the ineffective or the poorly run detention centres for young people. On slide 9, excuse me, if we look at a different perspective for social issues, if we look at the structural perspective, if there again is to be a source of any blame, there's usually a blaming of the system. So where does the problem come from? Where does that originate? So the source of the problem is often located in structural disadvantage, oppression, class, race, gender, the income distribution, unequal access to power. The solution from a structural perspective looks at structural change, changing the basis of oppression, consciousness raising, liberation movements, even a revolution will address these structural perspective. And again, you can perhaps think of examples that immediately may fit into this scenario, and some of the civil unrest that we're seeing in different parts of the world at the moment could perhaps be viewed from a structural perspective. When we actually look at a social issue or a concern from the perspective of post-structural, then if there is a source of blame at all, it might be blame the discourse. So in other words, blame the way that we think about it, blame the language. We've got the way that we talk about this issue around the wrong way. We're not using the correct language. So the source of the problem is then often located in modernity, in language, how we've formed language, and shared understandings, that these understandings contribute to this problem. So a solution in a post-structural perspective would be looking at having an analysis and an understanding of discourse and access to understandings, challenging and questioning of the rules. Perhaps we need to shift how we're thinking about this. Perhaps we need to use another way of speaking about it. We need to question that language. We're asking the wrong questions. So these 4 different account of social issues that IFE has put forward outlines different ways to look at social issues that go beyond the individual account. So the work is not all of his own, it's building on the work of Taylor, Goody and Dale. However, what he's actually proposing by organising these different perspectives is that there's value in each of these approaches, and there's a need to include elements of each. And if we're looking at social policy and how social policy works in our society, it usually works most heavily in those first 2 areas, when we were looking at the individual perspective and the institutional reformist perspective. These are the fields where social policy usually interacts, not in the latter 2. I just want to talk for a moment about a particular project that was a 3-year funded project in a suburb called Long Gully in a town, Bendigo, Central Victoria. And this 3-year project was focusing on the safety of children as a community concern. It deliberately used language in a way that put the care and the safety and the concern of kids central to the project. That was the focus of this particular project. And what actually evolved over a period of 3 years was engagement with a whole range of different people, not just children, with parents, with neighbours, with community members, with community leaders, with local businesses, with sport, and with schools. So local institutions, such as schools, who had a part in a role in that community, were involved in this project. It was a very significant project on many different levels, and one of the standout or significant outcomes with this project was that people wanted to see that children had access to the same opportunities that they might if they lived in another part of town, because this particular project was organised in a part of town where people were renting government housing, so people were in public housing, so subsidised rental accommodation, and the area was seen to be an area that had problems. The area was known to the police, the area was known to child protection because of concerns about safety and neglect issues of children. The area was known well to those services that provide mental health supports as well. So a whole range of people came together on not necessarily how are we going to solve the problem of this particular community, rather how are we going to create a community where kids have opportunities and where kids are safe. So by focusing on opportunities and creating places, events, opportunities for children and adults to interact in positive ways was the focus of this project. One of the outcomes that arose during the time of this project was setting up a local football team. And by having a local football team, this enabled businesses, enabled people who were passionate about the sport to come in. It enabled local kids to have a chance and actually create a team that had an identity in that local community. There were also employment opportunities, and for a number of local people who were involved in the different actions and activities of this project, a number of people actually got employment. They actually got roles out of that, and I know particularly a couple of parents many years later are actually still in the paid workforce. So for people in an area where generally employment levels are not high, some of these outcomes were seen to be really quite significant. I'm summarising incredibly what was a very significant and effective project. I don't want to oversimplify it at all, but the point that I'm wanting to make here is that the solutions and the responses in a particular project, in a particular community development, and in this case a community development project that involved a lot of community action, the solutions aren't always predictable or obvious. But at the outset, the people who came together because they were passionate about this project did not necessarily sit down and say, we will have a football club, we will have an after-school homework club for children, or we will have other events. Many of these events and activities, they arose out of the involvement of the local people in the project. And the opportunity for people in the community to interact in a meaningful and effective way with community leaders from other areas, and also to interact with local businesses and to talk about how local businesses could support and be part of their community, were conversations that had not been had before. I'm moving on to slide 11. Just a little bit more about social development in the context of the different terminologies that you may also be seeing in your reading, where the term fourth world has been used, where you will find that there are holes of exclusion in countries that are seen to be first world countries, such as Australia, where there is the country is seen to have access to opportunities, to education, to a high standard of living, to have a complicated social structure and system that provides support for its community members. In this same country, there exists pockets of what can be referred to as black holes of social exclusion, where people actually are living in circumstances that are referred to as fourth world, where they are often surrounded by the dominant and powerful and wealthy group and don't have equal access to those same resources. And particularly in rural and remote areas in Australia, this can be the experience, and particularly in some remote Aboriginal communities, that the experience will be that people are actually living in conditions that do not align with the rest of the country. What can result from that is that this notion of distorted development, that there can be such extreme disparities that may exist between those who have wealth and those who have access to resources, those who have access to participation opportunities and education and employment, and those who do not, as being so disparate that this is referred to as distorted development. In other words, there's an imbalance between economic and social prosperity. I guess the next slide 13 is just an opportunity for you to think about that idea. What do you think about that idea of distorted development? That idea of significant disparity between access to wealth and social prosperity. What do you think about that? And whether you might have some examples that are close to where you live, or maybe some in Australia, or some international examples where the differences between different parts of the society, different parts of community are stark. I'm going to link some of what we've been talking about to community work, and community work and community-based work focuses on establishing or re-establishing structures of human community within which new ways of relating, organising social life and meeting human need becomes possible. So given what we've just been talking about in terms of social development and how social development encompasses a whole range of developmental needs of human beings and looks at a population as a whole, how do we actually bring that to the community work context? And by bringing it again back to the human community, the human face, and the human opportunity for people to actually have access and talk about their desired goals for economic participation, their desired goals for how will people address inequality, or their desired goals about how people want to access education. The thing that needs to be emphasised here is that all elements need to be considered. And one of the criticisms in the commentary, definitely around social work, is that in spite of the rhetoric talking about wanting to challenge structures, that social work as a profession focuses very much at that individual perspective that we were talking about before. And this does not always allow for effective challenge of those broader perspectives and the broader structures that limit people's opportunity. One of the challenges in community development work is to always be looking at all of those opportunities, looking at all of the elements to be considered. So a range of people can be involved in social development and in community development work. They may be economists, they may be social workers, engineers, geographers, psychologists, business people. They may be humanitarian workers. So a whole range of different professions can be involved in social development through different roles and programs. It can also be community members and volunteers who are involved in doing this work. One of the readings for this week, Room to Read, if you have not read it, I encourage you to read it, is very much about an initiative that started from someone's passion, John Wood's passion, to see that children, particularly in developing countries, had access to books to read. And as this project developed, what he thought initially was going to be a simple thing of introducing books providing books to different villages, to different communities, and originally starting in Nepal, expanded because the power and the impact of having access to books then raises a whole lot of other issues around children's need to have access to somewhere to read them, to have libraries, to have schools, and this project, Room to Read, has expanded to then include providing opportunities particularly for girl children to have access to read. And then also looks at the needs of people having access to read books in their own language. I encourage you to read it because it demonstrates that people with a whole range of different backgrounds can be and are involved in this work. So an example of what might be known as social development organisation would be some of the organisations that you can see on slide 16. Red Cross, CARE, UNICEF. Some of these organisations are right at the forefront of social development. When we move that idea of social development that we've been talking about from what is often known as the third world, what is often being termed, many would say in a very patronising way, to label developing countries as third world, the notion of moving social development from the third world to all worlds is the quote on slide 17, that the terminology and the associated theories and practices are becoming increasingly relevant to social, economic, political and cultural conditions of people in so-called developed areas who are still experiencing poverty and social exclusion and injustice despite high levels of economic growth. So one of the challenges is also seeing that, again, this disparity and difference in populations is something that is challenging and we are faced with in Australia and other countries similar to Australia. The focus of social development is looking at how do we see these opportunities, the inclusion of all elements of development, be part of the work that we do. So slide 18 is looking at how social development can be used for addressing the difference. Again, these disparities in the first world context, such as Australia. So there are many different settings where, there may be a surface acceptance or embracing of multiculturalism, and yet many people would suggest that racism is at the heart of one of the challenges that Australia is facing at the moment, and that Australia has had huge difficulties and continues to have huge difficulties to really understand what multiculturalism means. What does it really mean to embrace and welcome people from other cultures and other countries to settle and to live in Australia? One of the challenges for community development workers, I think, is that it's often very much these issues that we have talked about, conflict, disagreement, racism, different viewpoints, different values, different worldviews, different backgrounds that often come to the fore and often come together in the context of community development work. So, for example, a community development worker is often involved in running community meetings that at this point highlights people coming together with very different views, with very diverse understandings and completely different backgrounds, and that often at this point is where, for the worker, the challenge with this work comes to the fore how the community development worker talks about language, talks about peace and non-violence, and talks about the values that are going to be inherent in the way that a meeting is run, or in the way that solutions are going to be discussed in the particular community in which one is working. That's the end for this week. Bye.